Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and in this video what I want to do is talk about CORS. Okay, what's CORS? Okay, let's spell it out for you. Cross Origin Resource Sharing, aka CORS. Okay, now you've probably ran into this issue a few times when working with third-party APIs, where hey, you find this really cool API, you want to build like an app with it, and then you try to get information from the API, but you get this error that says, "Sorry, you are not allowed. You're violating CORS policy." Yada 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 yada. Why does this happen? Okay. To understand why this happens, we got to understand sort of like the difference between the front end and the back end. So again, the front end is the code that runs in the user's browser, the back end on someone else's computer. So when you write, like, let's say like a React, Angular, Svelte, Vue app, when the user interacts with that application, it's running in the front end. Okay, it's actually running in the user's browser. Okay, so let me just give this a fill of this. Okay, so this is, let's say, your front end app or your website. Okay, the visual part. Okay, that's the part that's running in the user's browser. So they might click a button, and then your app, you say, hey, when they click this button, go request data from this third-party API, and then display it on the screen. So generally, that's going to be a back-end application. So basically, there's a server computer. So it's not running in your browser. It's not running in the user's browser. It's running on some server computer somewhere where this application is just freely running. Okay. So here's that server with third-party API. Okay, so you're making a request to the server saying, hey, I'd like to get information. Can I get information from you? Now again, remember, your website, your front end is running in the browser. And the browser has a security feature called cross-origin resource sharing. So the minute it sees that you are making a request, what it's going to do is that it's going to initially sort of like put like a blocker on it. Okay? And it's going to say, hey, well, hey, slow down there. Okay? I know you're making a request, but this doesn't look like it's your website. Okay? You're making a request to some other URL that's not the host that you're from. Okay, so for example, alexmercedcoder.com would be the domain, but if I made a request from alexmerced.com or alexmercedcoder.com to cheese.alexmercedcoder.com, even though it's the same domain name but a different subdomain, the browser thinks of them as two different websites. Okay, which makes sense when you think about it. Like, how many people have like a website that's a subdomain of Netlify or Heroku? So yeah, you'd want to treat those as different websites. Okay. So then what happens, it expects that this other website, this other origin, okay, that's because there's the word cross origin. So you're requesting resources from another origin. And it says, okay, well, we can only let this happen if that origin says that it's okay to let you request this. And the reason is it's a security feature to make sure that people don't take advantage of other people's APIs and cause mischief. Okay, so it gives you this layer where websites can control who's making requests to their server from their front end applications. But this feature only exists within the context of the browser. So essentially what's going to happen is that it's going to make a request. So if you ever actually look at the network tab when you make an API request, you'll notice that oftentimes you'll see like two requests. And like and you made like a get request to get data from this API, but you'll notice that it made an options request first. And you're like, what's an options request? Well, the options request is it asking the server is like, am I allowed to make this request? And what it's asking for is a handful of different headers. So these headers include access. Well, they all start off with access allow. That's how they all start. But then they end with allow origin, meaning like, hey, which other websites are allowed to make requests to the server? Access allow headers. When we get that request, what headers can be included in that request? and access allow methods. Well, beyond get requests, are post requests allowed? Are put requests allowed? Patch requests? Delete requests? Which types of requests are allowed? Okay, so the browser doesn't block them. So these headers need to be delivered so that way the browser knows what's allowed and what's not allowed. And if it's not told, it just assumes it's not allowed and then blocks your request. So people are like, how do I get over that? Well, the problem is you building your website cannot overcome this. Okay, this is it's on that third-party API to provide those headers, and you can't control the third-party API, but it does mean that there is a solution. Okay. So in that case, what you do is you create your own server. Okay. With your own API. And this seems like an extreme solution. We'll give you a couple different options. But the idea is you can make sure that your own server has those headers. So if you make a request to your server, okay, then you're going to be A-OK. Okay, no issues there. Okay, you'll get the green light because you made sure you put those headers as a response on your server. But once you make the request to your server, then what happens is that your server can then make the request to the third party. And notice your backend doesn't run in the browser. Their backend doesn't run in the browser. So the browser has now been cut out of the picture, and you can make this request successfully. Okay, and let me just make that bigger. Okay, so essentially so then what happens is that when this thing sends a response, it sends a response to your API, and then your API delivers it to you. Okay, and then you avoid all the problems. Okay, so that's sort of the way you get around CORS. So this server that you're creating is what's referred to as a proxy server, because you're not really making it to deliver your own data. You could, it can do multiple things, but you're really like, its role in this context here is just to be the middle person between your front-end website and this third-party API you're trying to access. And honestly, this is probably best practice on how to access that third-party API anyways, because here in the back-end, you can hide your API keys, hide any kind of credentials, payment information, things like that you can't really hide on the front end. Because even if you find ways to obfuscate the data or hide it from GitHub, people can still look at the code that's running in the browser. They can look at the requests that the browser's making. It's near impossible, if not impossible, to truly hide your credentials in the browser. So then you get really dependent on like CORS headers, because that CORS headers are going to be the only way to control people from misusing your credentials that you're exposing in the browser. Okay, that's generally how like Google APIs work. You can use Google APIs in your front-end applications, but generally you have to go whitelist the website on their dashboard. So you actually say, hey, this is my website's domain. So that way when you use those credentials, you can only use it from the domain that you allowed. So that way people can't misuse your credentials. Okay, so that's basically the solution. I need to make my own server. Now there are people who create their own proxy servers that they allow for like public usage. They tend to be kind of slow. You'll hear this thing called like Heroku CORS Anywhere if you Google it. That's a good solution when you're practicing, but it is again kind of slow and limited in what you can do. Sometimes you need to do some really specific stuff for your particular request, and you're not going to really be able to tailor it to your needs. So we'll show you some ways to create your own custom server that can handle how you would do that. So like the most extreme solution is just to create your own server, and basically this could also be referred to as a microservice, because you're not building like a full-on server to do lots and lots of things. You're just building one server to do specific things, and a lot of applications nowadays will do that a lot. They'll create a lot of little mini servers that do many things, and these are called microservices. Okay, and those microservices might provide that service to multiple apps. Okay, it's a much more sort of decentralized application world. It's not just one big app anymore, but one app that interacts with all these different services. Okay, so with that, let's head over to VS Code. The easiest way to do it is probably with Express. Okay, using Express.js. So let's just create a folder. We'll call this proxy server. I'm not going to deploy it. This is just going to show you just sort of the rundown. What would be the quickest way to do it. Oops, I want to open up the terminal in that folder. And essentially what you'd want to do is you would want to first initialize a npm project, okay, which means you'd need to have Node installed. And if you're not familiar with Node or Express or anything like that, like this is all fresh to you, I would recommend watching my Intro to Express videos, because, or if you have no backend exposure at all, yeah, just watch those Intro to Express videos to get you acclimated, because this would be really hard if all your experience is just purely front end. And, you know, so then you just can't overcome CORS then. Okay? npm init-y, or you'd have to have backend people do it for you. Okay, but npm init-y, this is going to create a new npm project. So see, I get this package.json. Okay, wonderful. Now I'm going to make sure that I'm using the latest version of Node, nvm use system. I use something called Node Version Manager that allows me to switch versions of Node on the fly. Okay, so good, I switched. Now, let's see here. What I want to do next is I want to install Express. So I do npm. I have to be in the same folder as my package.json. Okay, so like I'm in the proxy server folder. I want to install Express and I want to install CORS. Okay, these are the two things that I want to install. Okay, nice. Now I just need to create a file to write my server in. So I'll just do touch server.js. And I would just write a standard Express server. So I would just say, like, first I import Express, so const Express equals require Express. So that's importing the library so we can use it. And then I have to create my application object, const app equals the result of Express. That gives me an application object to build my application. Then over here I would write app.listen. Okay, but we need to specify a port. Generally what you want to do is you want to create a variable called port, which should equal process.env.port, or if there is no port specified, then 3000. Actually, let's make it 4000. Doesn't really matter what the number is. You just don't want it to be 80, 443, or 6000. Avoid those numbers. Okay, but otherwise it can be any number between like 1 and 65,000. Okay. Cool. And the reason for this is because you eventually need to deploy it. This is not going to help you on your computer. You'll build it on your computer and develop it on your computer, but eventually you need to deploy it to something like Heroku or somewhere else. And they're probably going to give you a port to serve your application through this variable. So if you don't pull from that variable, it won't work when you deploy it in Heroku. Cool. So now that I have that port, I can then say, hey, I want my server to listen on that port. And when the server starts listening for requests, console.log listening on port. There we go. So in this case, there we've kind of set up our server. Now what I want to do is I'd want to set up my request headers, those CORS headers. There's two ways I can do it. I can do app.use and use the CORS middleware. And again, I'd have to import that. So I would do const CORS equals require CORS. This is one way, and this will set up all those headers for me, and that'd be great. Okay, but what if you want to do like custom stuff? You can do app.use and you can create your own custom middleware. But you would just create a function that does this, res.res next. And you can just manually set the headers. Now, I always forget the exact syntax. I think it's like res.headers.set or something like that, but let's see here. Setting response headers in Express. And every backend framework, if you're using Fastify, Koa, or you're using a different language, like you're using like Flask and Python or Sinatra and Ruby, they all have a way of setting these response headers. So you just Google it. And there it is. Okay, so it's just res.set. Okay. Easy enough. Okay, or pass an object to say multiple fields at once. And we can also just do it as res.header. Okay, cool. Easy enough. So essentially what I could do is, instead of using the CORS middleware, if I just wanted to kind of do my own custom settings, you could also customize the CORS middleware if you read its documentation, like this thing. Like you can pass it an object that customizes it. But I could do this just so you can understand, like, it doesn't matter what the framework is. You don't have to hope that there's a third-party library that does this for you. You could just set the headers yourself. So I could just be like res.header. Okay, and then basically I would put the name of the header. Okay. Res.header, and then I would say access allow origin, because that's the header. And then I would then say asterisk. Asterisk means any website. Okay, but if I really wanted like a particular website, like particular domain, I could be like cheese.alexmerced.com, and then that will be allowed. Now it's been whitelisted, and I could do multiple values. I would just separate them by commas. Okay, but I'm just gonna do that, and then res.header. Okay. Actually, I think I wanted to use that set header. Set header. Set header. And then would be access allow methods. Let's allow all methods. And res.set header allow or access allow headers or access allow header. I always forget which one it is. You can always Google that. Okay, CORS headers. Oh, MDN, always here for me. Okay, and if you just write down here somewhere where it just has them all head back to back. Here we go. So here we go. Access control allow origin. Oh, okay, so this is an extra word. So it's access control allow headers, allow methods, origin. And then there's max age, which just kind of controls like how long the request can be open for, but not as important. So it's really access control allow origin, access control allow methods, access control allow headers. And essentially what this does is just sets those headers and says, hey, any method, any origin, any header. So this is me doing it manually. And you can do this again in any framework. You don't have to use Node with Express. You can literally use any framework in any language to create a web server. Just look up whatever like a backend web framework is in that language and just do the thing. Okay, so now that I've set the headers, that's what this is doing. It's setting the headers. Okay, I'm just doing the same thing twice, so it doesn't matter. Then what I would do is I would write a route app.get. We'll just call this like get data or something. And we do rec res. I would then put in all my logic, all logic to get data here. Okay, and so you would put whatever logic it takes for you to get your data from the API in here, and then you would just send the data back with res.json, the data. And then that would get sent back, and then you'd be good to go. And then that's it. That would be that does the job that you want to do, and you can create additional routes for additional API calls or anything you need. But then you have to deploy this, and this might seem like a little overkill just for like one request. Okay, so is there another option? Yeah, there is. Let's pretend that you're building your app with like Vercel or Netlify. Okay, in that case, they do have a feature for cloud functions. And beauty of cloud functions is like having a cloud function. Essentially what you're doing is going back to my whiteboard. Imagine you're using someone else's server, like Netlify or Vercel. And instead of building your own server, what they do is they say, hey, we're going to let you have one function on our server. So you write a function that does whatever you need to do, and we're going to give you a URL that when you call that URL, that function will trigger. Okay? So in that case, all you have to do is instead of writing a whole server, you just write one little cloud function. Okay? And let's just give that a fill. Okay? And you're just writing these functions on their server. They give you a URL, and then your website instead will just make a request to the function. And then the function will carry out those instructions on Netlify's web server or Vercel's web server, which is really at the end of the day Amazon's web servers, to do that thing. Okay? And life's easy. And the cool thing is that, like, if you're using Vercel, the syntax is just like Express. If you're using Netlify, it's not that far off. And I got some tutorials on that, just so you can see how that would work. So if you head over to toots.alexmercedcoder.com, this is my blog. Just look up, first we'll look up Vercel. And so you can see both articles back to back, how to use Netlify Cloud Functions, how to use Vercel Cloud Functions. Cool. So basically what we're going to do is, let's pretend that this is like your, let's pretend like this is your project, right? This is your project in Vercel or Netlify. To do it in Vercel, what you're going to do is you have to create a folder. I'm pretty sure it should be called API. Let me just double check. Yep, in this folder, create a new subfolder called API. So you would create a folder, new folder called API. This is for Vercel. And then essentially what happens is that when you upload your project to Vercel, whether it's React, Vue, Svelte, Angular, it sees this API folder and will automatically determine that any functions inside of that folder are cloud functions. So it'll make them available to you as like these back-end functions for your front end. So you don't have to create a whole web server, you just create a function. And the cool thing is, you don't have to necessarily, since you built it into your project, they're going to have the same origin, so you don't necessarily have to worry about setting CORS headers. The reason I had to set CORS headers here is because I'm going to make a separate Heroku deployment, so my server still needs to provide the headers to allow my front end, because there's still two different origins. But with Cloud Functions, if you're deploying using Netlify or Vercel, your front end, they're going to end up being on the same, they're part of the same origin, okay, because it'll be part of like your domain that you have with Netlify or Vercel, so you don't necessarily have to worry about that, because you're allowed to make same origin requests. Although it's never a bad idea to set those headers, especially if you plan on doing it from, if you're setting up a Vercel or Netlify project separate from your front end, just to have Cloud Functions. Okay, but essentially what you would do is, in this API folder, you can create a file that's called, it doesn't matter what you call it. Okay, so if I call it cheese.js, that's fine. Okay, and then I would just put in the logic for my server. Okay, so like, for example, copy. And see, it looks just like a request route. So you have rec, you have res, okay, and it has access to any libraries you installed for the project. So if I installed like CORS or any of the things that I installed here in package.json, I can use them in this file, which is pretty cool. But essentially what you do is you just write a route. So I would write all my logic here, logic to get data. Okay, logic to get data, and then what I would do is I would just at the end send the data back. And so then what would happen is that basically I'd be able to make a request to /API/cheese, and that would go then make the API call for me, and I'd be good to go. Okay, so with Vercel it's actually pretty easy. Now let's take a look at how it would work for Netlify. Now for Netlify, okay, the way it would work is first in your main folder, and I think they have simplified this a little bit. Like, let me go double check. Let me go read the Netlify functions documentation, because I think they make it now you could just make a folder. You don't have to like do the whole netlify.toml thing as much anymore. I like to set it up because I like to have the netlify toml there, but it's like a configuration file for Netlify. But let's just see here. Netlify functions, your base. Okay, the get started designated directory where you can find your serverless background. Netlify will access this directory. So you could do this. You could do this within Netlify's dashboard. You can designate a functions directory, and that would be the folder where you would put your functions. But the other way you can do it is you can just do the netlify.toml, which is what I'm going to do. So I have in my blog article, I have a copy of the netlify.toml, or like a boilerplate to make life easier for you. So what I would do is in the main folder of my project, I would create the netlify.toml. It has to be in the root of your project. And essentially what this does, it says, hey, like, basically this is like the what folder should be served once you build the application. If I want to specify like a build command, I could do that here. So a lot of this is commented in case you do want to use any of this. Functions, that's the folder that that's going to be where the functions are written. So I'd create a new folder called functions. And that's going to be where Netlify looks to see if there's any functions written in there, in the same way that Vercel just defaults the API. Okay. This is just a section for redirects. This is usually used if you're like dealing with things like React Router and things like that. And then these are headers. So like if you want to make sure that people could make requests to your front end website, you would do that here. I forget if that's going to also work for your functions. I think in the functions you still have to separately set the headers, but that's a thing that's there. So like generally, like if you want to have JSON files in your front end and you want people to be able to request them, you just uncomment this out, and you can customize it. But that's all commented out. It's not necessary. So once we know that there's a functions folder, we can again create files in here. Cheese.js. The cool thing is, again, I don't have to create a server. It's just deployed along with my front end to Netlify or Vercel, so I don't have to really like think about it. It can use any libraries that I have installed for my front end. So anything that's in my package.json is free game to use inside of my function. Okay, the only difference here is that it's going to use more of like a raw node syntax. So let me see if I can get to it. Okay, so like here's an example. Okay, actually, not even a raw node syntax. It's going to use more of an AWS Lambda syntax. Okay, where basically you have this event, which has the details of the event, which includes like path, HTTP method, headers, query string parameters, the body. So you can grab all that data from there, and you can use it to do whatever you want. And then you would return an object like this that has all the headers you want. So you would add all the headers in here, status code, the request body with whatever you're sending back. Okay, in this case I sent back all that information, but basically you would end up doing the same thing. You can just follow this template and you should be fine and good to go. But yeah, that's all it would take. So you could use that as a way to make your API calls. So if you have a request that's being blocked by CORS, you would just make it in one of these cloud functions. If you're depending on whether you're deploying to Vercel or Netlify, it would be just part of your project. And then what you would do is in your front end, you would make a request to the function instead of a request to. The only thing that makes it kind of annoying is that it's kind of hard to initially test locally. So you need to kind of like deploy the function first and then check it out. But then you probably will have to set the CORS headers because your local host is not the same thing as like their Netlify URL. So just some things to keep in mind. But otherwise, this is a great solution. It's a lot simpler than creating a whole server. You don't have to worry about the uptime and downtime as you would if you were using Heroku for free serving of your backend. So that would be the way you would overcome CORS. Okay, there really isn't another option. You could either create your own server or you can create a cloud function. There are other providers of cloud functions. I think there's like a website called like begin.com. Okay. Is that it? Effortlessly ship apps and APIs to AWS. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they have serverless, but more. Zero lock never. Background task, framework agnostic. Yeah, this should have some features for making cloud functions. Render, I don't think currently has them yet, but I wouldn't be surprised in the future if you'll be able to use cloud functions on Render. Heroku, you can just make your own server, so they don't have cloud functions, at least not yet. That would be a nice feature. Or you could always just go direct. You can go direct to AWS, Azure, Microsoft Azure, or Google Cloud, Google Cloud, GCP, Google Cloud Products, and either one of those they're essentially the big three cloud providers. So that's going to be where you can just do cloud functions natively. But the easiest way is with Vercel and Netlify for now. Like if you're just building like really simple cloud functions for your front end and you're deploying through Vercel and Netlify, just use their cloud functions platform. It's super easy, and you can do it in multiple languages. And Netlify, you can use Go or JavaScript, and on Vercel, you can literally use any language. There's a bunch of languages they natively support, but then there's a bunch of like little like plugin packs you can download to use literally any language you want. So that's cool. With that, I think we're gonna wrap this video up. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Hopefully you guys found this useful, educational, and enlightening. Make sure to head over to devnurture.com to find more content and to also subscribe or join the Discord and Slack communities there to meet other developers. And if you have, episode ideas, just send them over. I'm always looking forward to see what people want to learn. So I'll see you all later. Have a great day and enjoy.